everybody for being here, and buenas tardes. I just want to start our time today first honoring this special time that we're having together. It is miraculous for us to think that we as a human beings are allowed this opportunity to be together in the midst of the difficult circumstances that we all are experiencing in the world, and especially in our communities of color, our people that have been living in the margins, experiencing so much pain, even more than many of other us. And yet we have a great opportunity to be together, and we have so much to thank. And I want to first thank our ancestors that allow us this opportunity, the protectors of this land, the people that actually many of us are in the area of Portland area, Hillsborough area. So to the Calapuyas people that take care for this land and also allow us to be here and hosted us and welcome many of us, like me being an immigrant. I want to thank them and thank you if you for making this possible for us. I want to say this is a program that we have at Sabiduria, a Latinx psychology emphasis at Pacific University. I will be sharing some links here today about who we are, so I don't have to share much about who we are. But also I want to thank Trauma Informed Oregon, who actually allow us and supported us for us to bring this training today. So thank you. We are for a wonderful treat today with Dr. Sharon Law and two Sabiduria students, Sandra Morales and Alicia Vasquez. And I just gonna let them introduce themselves and just delight us with this presentation. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Zuniga. I'm Dr. Lowe, you can call me Sharon, and I'm a clinical psychologist. I specialize in working with kids and families. And I'll let Alicia and Sandra introduce themselves as well.
Go ahead, Sandra.
Okay, hi, I'm Sandra Morales. I am from the southmost part of Texas. I am in I'm a second year in the PhD program in Pacific University, and also I am part of the Sabiduria program.
And I'm Alicia Vasquez. I'm also a second year in the PhD program with Pacific University and part of the Sabiduria program as well.
And so we're really excited that you've joined us today, and thank you. I imagine that people are coming in from either a long school day, long school week, long school month, long school year, and you may be multitasking. You might be getting together meals, whatever it is that you may be doing around 5:10, or if you happen to be joining in on a recording, welcoming you wherever you are and whenever you're viewing this. And this is a practice-based talk. So we have a lot of mini practices, ones that you can use for yourself and potentially in the classroom as quick reset, quick break. And then we'll also distribute handouts at the end that lay out some of the key points that are covered in the talk and also the practices. So you by no means need to feel like you have to remember and retain everything that you're going to be hearing. We have that all written down for you. And then we'll save the Q&A for the very end. And that part won't be recorded, just so we can maintain the anonymity of our attendees. And so we'll just jump right into some of the practices. This is one that I do usually around mid-afternoon slump. So it's meant to kind of re-energize you if you need it. So this doesn't need, you can do this while seated or standing. And just noticing your feet touching the ground. So often we are walking, standing, seated on the ground, and yet we don't notice it all too much. So just taking the time to kind of notice your feet on the ground. And then this is called rising mist and falling rain. And we're going to use our arms, and we'll lift or have your palms up towards the ceiling and down by your sides. And then on an inhale, you're going to reach up your arms and stretch, try and stretch as high as you can to the sky. And then on an exhale, you can turn your palms down to the ground and just exhale it out. Good. And shake it out. And go ahead and do it a few more times. Let's say 3 more times on your own inhale and exhale. And exhale. And again, inhale. And exhale. And one more. Awesome. And then this next one is one that is called a minute to arrive. So literally 60 seconds can be done in any type of transition. If you're about to transition into a meeting or out of a meeting, taking just 60 seconds, even 30 seconds, if you feel like you don't have that full minute, to do whatever it is that you need to do to kind of get yourself into a space in it to arrive fully, right? In our world right now, it's like arriving fully into a Zoom room. So for me, most of the times that's just closing my eyes, breathing, noticing my breath. So you can go ahead and do that now, and I'll talk a little bit as you're tuning into your breath. These inhales and exhales that we have, there's about 22,000 cycles of breath that we have per day. And so as you're inhaling and exhaling, that's one cycle. And so what is it like for you to just notice just one of those cycles? Go ahead and just take maybe 3 more breaths here. Good. And then just inviting everyone to arrive in this space however suits you and best supports your learning. And that can look a lot of different ways for a lot of different people. And so if you're moving about and moving around and that suits your learning, that's great. And if you need to get in the most comfortable position ever, reclined and just listening, that's also welcome here. And now we'll hop into the juicy meat of the emotion regulation and resilience talk. So let me just pull up these slides. Okay, and this talk has really been tailored for educators of elementary and middle school students, particularly those working with students of color, and then specifically those in school leadership who also support educators. And the reason for that is, as clinical psychologists, we've received so many questions about how to best support student of color mental health and emotional well-being. And so I thought it was important to first start with one of the number one recommendation that's provided in the latest evidence-based interventions and curriculum that we have at this point. And the number one recommendation, number one step that every single one starts with is always, it's educator investment in their own regulation practices and their own well-being. And so when I think about it from a systems perspective, then I think, well, really, then the number one recommendation that we should really start with is support from school leadership. And so if the end goal really is to improve well-being of your students and increase emotion regulation, then this needs to be reflected in what leadership is stating matters, and providing those appropriate resources, appropriate training, appropriate time for educators, right? That it's not time that's then tacked on to everything else that educators are already doing, but it's time taken out and devoted. right, to learning how to engage in our own regulation practices and supporting our own well-being. And while this might be obvious to some in the group, I think it's also worth stating that when it comes to supporting students of color in particular, that it cannot all be on the educators of color to really lead these efforts, right? So this is taken from a quote from Learning for Justice magazine, and it's going to be in the resources and in your handout. And so this quote, I think, really captures that. So racism puts enough burdens on educators of color. White colleagues can't also expect them to end it. And so to our white colleagues, we really need your voices too. And this is a good place to start to really invest in your own emotion regulation skills and work to really acknowledge the blind spots and assumptions that we all hold, as humans. And so these are just 2 points to keep in mind as we continue on today. And the other things that we're going to cover, so starting with just defining what emotion regulation and what resilience is. Resilience is probably one of those terms that we've heard thrown a lot around, particularly this past year. And cover some of the most common misconceptions in these 2 different domains, and then jump into even more practice. So what is it? What is emotion regulation? When we think about the defining emotion regulation, it's really defined as a set of dynamic processes that help us manage our emotions. One of the models that I like to use a lot is, and some of you actually may use it in your classrooms. I've used this hand model from Dr. Dan Siegel for kids as young as preschool. So anybody can learn about the brain and where our emotions originate from. And the idea is that we have our emotion center, our amygdala, that's right in the middle here, and then our fingers hug around it. And so these fingers in the front are prefrontal cortex. That's where all of our executive functions come into play. These are our capacities to plan, to make decisions, to think flexibly, to organize. And when our emotions get really hot and when our emotions get really big, and this could be even triggered by something very small, just based off of the previous stressors and experiences that we've had, then what happens is you flip your lid and you lose it, right? You can't access these frontal lobe capacities anymore. And so regulation then is about how do we go from here, having a flipped lid, and then trying to regulate this back down where we can access our control center a little bit better. And so in thinking about some of the most common misconceptions about emotion regulation, this is one that I hear a lot. So stable versus dynamic. Those, I hear, oh, well, students who have really well-developed emotion regulation skills should look like this. They should look like a student who is really calm and controlled all the time, and they're unflappable. They're really not impacted by stress going on in their environment. And that might be true for some, but actually we find that those who engage in have well-developed emotion regulation skills actually, let's think back to the definition, right? That it is something that is dynamic. It's a dynamic process and it's changing. And so that in actuality, it's about flexibly really feeling our emotions and feeling our feelings when they come up in the moment and not necessarily reacting to them, right? Responding to them in an impulsive or reactive way, but allowing room and feeling them. And so there's a very, popular emotion scientist and clinical psychologist, Dr. Richie Davidson, who works very closely with the Dalai Lama. And he describes the Dalai Lama as having one of the greatest dynamic ranges of emotion than any other human being that he's ever met, right? So this is about being able to be flexible and experiencing those emotions. And then willpower versus context. This is probably one of the most important misconceptions to address. And that this is really about, a lot of the literature that was on delay of gratification and the marshmallow task that you're probably familiar with, where students who were waiting a longer period of time for that second marshmallow, it ended up predicting these long-term outcomes with academics and life outcomes, social outcomes, all these things that we really care about. And everyone thought, oh, okay, I see what it is. It's just that certain kids struggle with this and they don't have this skill. So a very kind of deficit-based model. But what was really missing was that it's actually about what have these children learned in previous contexts that were actually adaptive for whatever context they were in, right? So some of these investigations were in working with children from impoverished backgrounds, where they realized that it was actually quite adaptive and smart for these children to be taking that marshmallow, because who knew, who for those children, they didn't know whether or not they were going to be able to have that opportunity to take that food at whatever point in time, right? That was something that they learned within their context. And so this is something that's extremely important, especially thinking about, say, this past year. So it's this, a time scale of what is our short-term versus long-term coping method, because the immediacy of being in survival mode and needing to enact specific regulation strategies that serve the moment instead of the long term are adaptive and healthy. That's actually our system working. The problem and the issue that arises is that when we then need to move into a context such as like a school classroom, where those expectations are different, those strategies may not work as effectively for whatever the school classroom and environment is asking for. Right? But knowing that, you end up viewing the child very differently. You know, if you start thinking about it, you know what? These strategy, whatever, the way that this child is responding right now was adaptive at some point for them. It was their system protecting them, right? That's a very different mindset than having a more deficit-based view of a child. And then outcome versus process. So really what this one's referring to is that our, you know, this skill development, this emotion regulation is a lifelong process. There's no sort of like, I've achieved being emotionally regulated and I have done it, right? At all our different developmental milestones, and then throughout our adulthood, we experience different stressors, right? And I don't think that, you know, I think we've all experienced that this past year. It's been very obvious. And at different points in time, we need different regulation strategies, right? So I know for myself that pre-pandemic and pre-lockdown, there are certain relaxation exercises that I do that were totally not effective once pandemic and lockdown hit, right? I needed something completely different. And so it's more about learning the skill of how do I check in with myself and realize that, oh, I see, I just need a different type of strategy. Let me try and find something that's more effective. And how do you go about doing that? How do you go about testing that out for yourself? So those are some of the other things that we'll talk about today. And then what about resilience? We're going to use this idea of the person as a bubble. And you can imagine the bubble can actually, you can also use this as like a system. The bubble can represent an organization, a school, things of that sort. The definition of resilience is that it's the capacity of a dynamic. Again, you hear that, the dynamic, something that's changing, a dynamic system to adapt successfully to disturbances that threaten system function, viability, or development. So really the key here, there are two like key points. One is that it's dynamic. So you're still talking about a process that changes. The second point is that there's a threat to the system. So inherent to this definition is that there is something that is potentially harming or jeopardizing this system at play. And so you can imagine other bubbles in our environment coming in, right? Pandemic stress, it could be anxiety, isolation, racial trauma. And then you can also bring in other bubbles that are just in your environment, and they can have positive and negative influences on your bubble, right? So with school can come with stress too. And also it comes with positive peer experiences. And then other kind of environmental pieces that we might engage with, right? Support, family, exercise. So, you know, you can imagine this for yourself, you know, for somebody, I'm a very visual learner. And so I something like this, I really glom onto. And so if you're also quite a visual learner, you can imagine just, you know, check in with yourself to think, and you can even chat it if you wish, like, what are the other bubbles that are in your space, right? That are potentially influencing you. And you can also think about depending on how malleable our bubble outside is to things like, how willing am I to take in support right now? How much am I going to be influenced by this pandemic stress right now? And then how much may I be influenced by racial trauma, right? The degree to which your bubble is permeable to then merge with some of these things depends on what were your previous exposures, right? What were your previous experiences, right? So for those of us who have experienced things like racial discrimination and microaggression and modern day racism, right? Our bubbles are probably more permeable to being influenced by something like racial trauma. And so then the thing that I just want to note, like the misconception piece, I guess, it's more of like a caveat about resilience. The way that it's been used this year has been, oh yes, like just be more resilient. And the messaging about that I think has been problematic is that, again, inherent in the definition is that there is a threat and a harm to the system. And so, the messaging is that you just want to be careful about not glorifying that a harm and threat has occurred, right? And it's not okay that these threats have occurred. And I think that that's something that we need to remember. And so then kind of moving into the space of, well, how do we get more emotionally flexible and regulated? Once we kind of take in these different pieces of our environment, both positive and negative influences, we might be at a different state afterwards. How much of that do we want to keep in? How much do we then shift back to our baseline? And what can we do to kind of get there? So the very first one is practicing a lot. So the more that you practice, the better that you're going to get at these things. And this curious scientific mindset really kind of ties in with the approach, the how piece. And so in all my years of working on different developing interventions and delivering interventions to really improve emotion regulation skills, at the end of the day, the content itself, the what that's being taught ultimately isn't all that important, which is kind of like, so just hang in with me. So, and it's really about the how. How are you going about approaching these strategies? Are you gritting your teeth and being like, I have to be so disciplined and I have to do it perfect and I have to make sure that I do X, Y, Z and I practice this at this time in this way, and that if I don't get it and if suddenly I'm not cool as a cucumber, then it means it didn't work and that I'm a failure, right? So that type of approach and that like spiraling of what sometimes happens in, say, like the self-care world, it's happened to me for sure. Those strategies end up not being as effective. And so if you end up approaching it from this mindset of, I wonder what my emotions are telling me. And say if what's kind of coming back is an indicator of you're really stressed, you're super anxious. It's not about, oh man, like, how am I still so anxious? How am I still so stressed about this? How am I still so overwhelmed about this? It's more about, I wonder what I'm needing, and I wonder what this emotion is telling me about what I really care about, because that's what our emotions are for. And so it's taking this really non-judgmental approach, and really with all of these practices, all the ones that we're about to go into right now, they're all very person-to-person based and situation dependent. And so what that means is that you have to do a trial and error. And see what works for you and what doesn't. And so, if it happens that you're not a yoga person, you're not a yoga person. That's okay. There's a lot of different other strategies that you can engage with. And so this is where, this idea of like, truly there are no shoulds in this place. Like when you see those big like lists of like, yeah, like do this, do that, you should be eating healthier. You should be doing this. There are no shoulds when you get to decide what it is that you need, period. You get to decide this. And so this is a curriculum that some of you may have heard of before, the Ruler curriculum. It came out of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. This is also going to be in your resources handout. So links to their trainings, free online courses that they've developed. And they break up emotion regulation strategies across all of these different domains. Right. So physiological regulation, this might be like our breathing practices. Self-care are things like eating, making sure that you're well fed and not going hangry. It could be things like rest, healthy relationships, managing thoughts, managing environment. So all of these different domains. So this is just to say that even if one strategy doesn't work under one of these domains, there's plenty of other ones. We're going to cover some of the ones in, we'll do this one, physiological regulation, managing thoughts. So we'll cover some of these today. Our very first, well, actually, I guess we already did some practice. So continuing practice. So the mood meter is one of the Ruler curriculum tools. And some of you may be familiar with this, but I'll just kind of run through and orient you. On the y-axis here, up and down, you see energy level. So this is really, are we feeling super high energy and we have a lot of nerves going on, a lot of up here? It's kind of like this, like you're busy. Or are you feeling super sluggish and down and mellow? So I'm actually also bringing in some of the x-axis down here, which is the pleasant and unpleasant. So here in the blue category, you're really thinking about like lethargic, fatigue, down, I can't get out of bed. Up here is going to be your more kind of anxious monkey mind. And pleasant emotions here are, this is like mellow, I'm super chill, very relaxed. And this is like ecstatic and joyful. And so there are other, if you kind of Google image this, you will see other types of, even those who have identified the specific quadrants, and you can see that the range, right, the dynamic range of how many different emotion words we have to capture this. And so again, this is a curriculum that people have used with children as young as preschool, doing a check-in at the very beginning of day. I think the most important piece, I'm just going to flip back to this because it's easier to look at this. The most important piece to this to note is the pleasant and unpleasant. Notice that we're not calling it bad and good or positive and negative. And this is really to reflect, yes, probably a majority of us have spent much of our space in here. And it's not about just only feeling this all the time, right? This would also be problematic if you were only experiencing these all the time. It's about how do we garner a greater sense of balance between these two. And then the other thing to note is that you can also feel, you can be in multiple places, you can be in multiple quadrants. And so go ahead and we're going to take a little bit of time to just take a look at this, see where you might be landing right now. So a little check-in with yourself. And you can feel free to chat it in, either the quadrant, or you can use numbers. And you can also, mentally note it if you don't wish to share in the chat. And the importance to this is that before engaging in other types of regulation strategies, you got to know what you're regulating. So if I'm in here, so I'm probably feeling like around this. The regulation strategies that I need for this are going to look different if I'm having trouble getting off the couch and having trouble getting out of bed, right? So I'd probably need something a little bit more activating, like trying to go out for a walk around the block if I'm here in the blue. And if I'm here, then we'd probably need something a little bit more releasing. So that's what we're going to do on this next slide. Oh, and this is the follow-up question that I was kind of referring to, that once you kind of identify where you are on this grid, then you can ask this question about what exactly is your emotion telling you about what you're needing in the moment. as well as what you potentially care about. And so this is one of those breaths that is much more, it's gonna be different than the rising mist, falling rain, which is supposed to be a little bit more activating. This one is relaxing and releasing. And so I'm gonna let Alicia walk us through this one.
Yeah, so in those moments where we're noticing that we kind of maybe need to bring down our energy or just deepen our relaxation a little bit, we can use this technique, and it's really simple. So it just involves breathing in, so inhaling through your nose, and then on your exhale, you're gonna either make a shh sound or a bzz sound. So whichever one kind of feels right for you in the moment. And then as you're doing that, also being able to play around with the breath a little bit. So trying to elongate it on some breaths or shorten it on other breaths. And just noticing how that shift or how playing with those breaths is affecting your body, and noticing in that moment how you're feeling in terms of if you're able to be a little bit more relaxed. So we'll go ahead and do 3 of those. So if you want to breathe in and then exhale, and then breathe in, exhale, and one more, breathe in and exhale. And then maybe just take a moment to check in and notice any differences that you're seeing in the body.
Thanks, Alicia. I feel better. Usually you feel like that, that release from the chest. Usually the bumblebee breath I use with younger kids. Sometimes older kids like the shh, it's like telling somebody to shush. And this next one, so this is in the category of managing thoughts. And in psychology, it's a term that we title thought reappraisal. So you're basically trying to reframe your thought. And so for us right now in practicing this, inviting you to call to mind a mildly irritating scenario that you might find yourself in, or mildly stressful. Okay, and then once you have that in mind, this next piece, and some of you may have done this before, but imagining your best friend and imagining that friend or loved one, family member might be in the exact same situation. What might you tell them in the moment? And so if you have access to, even your computer, like something that you could type out or write out, you'll get a little bit more out of this exercise. So we'll take a few minutes here. And you can feel free to keep kind of working on that or mulling that over if you're working on it. This really comes from a lot of work that suggests we have a very difficult time expressing compassion for ourselves. And oftentimes it's way easier to imagine it for somebody else. And so the more that you do this, the more that you'll kind of naturally start doing it for yourself. For me, I can take a mildly irritating or stressful situation now, and the things that I would likely say to a best friend are like, change takes time. You just have to be patient, give it some time. You know, you're doing the best that you can. Right. And I probably would not come up with those words like just on my own to say to myself. And so this is something that oftentimes students will also find some utility from. And at the same time, it doesn't always work. So this is like the trial error practice and figure out the situation where it does work for you. And other times, like there are certain times where like, yeah, I'm not going to try and like reframe that thought. I'm upset. Okay. And then this is our next exercise that Sandra will walk us through, our 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay, yes, and I just lost it. Okay, sorry. All right, so this exercise is a grounding exercise. This exercise can be used in a multitude of situations. For me, I would say that I use it when I'm anxious. So one of the first things that I do want us to acknowledge first before starting this exercise, I want us to pay attention to our breath. Are we having rapid breath? Are we having shallow breath? For me, right now, I'm having a little bit of rapid breath because I'm having to talk to y'all. So the way that I'm speaking might be a little bit faster than I usually would. But let us now, like, once we find our breath, so let's take 3 deep breaths. I want us to first acknowledge 5 things that you can see in your surroundings. It could be a pen, it could be a spot in the ceiling, it could be your phone that keeps buzzing while you're trying to do this meditation. Okay, now that we have acknowledged 5 things that we can see, I want us then to acknowledge 4 things that you can touch around you. It could be your hair. It could be the chair that you're sitting on right now. It could be your dog that's running through your legs. Or it could be simply just your hands touching your other hand. Now that we've acknowledged 4 things that we can touch, we will move on to acknowledging 3 things that you can hear. It could be your refrigerator that's buzzing. It could be your dog or your cat that is trying to get your attention right now. Or it could be the sound of my voice if you haven't ignored me yet. Now that we've acknowledged 5 things that we can see, 4 things that we can touch, 3 things that we can hear, I want us to take a second and acknowledge 2 things that you can smell. It could be the form of your new air freshener that you just bought, the candle that is burning, or maybe the food that you forgot in your microwave. Now, lastly, I want us to acknowledge 1 thing that you can taste. What are you drinking right now? Are you chewing on a granola bar? Or are you just tasting your own saliva because you haven't ate anything? I like to put a spin, like a little quirky, fun spin on this because I want it to be adaptable to children as well. has been my experience that making it a funny situation allows the children to be able to engage longer in the activity that you're trying to do with them. So this, again, this is, you could use it in a situation where the child or yourself, you know, you're about to explode and you're like, okay, I'm gonna take 3 deep breaths. I'm a little out of control right now, and I'm gonna do this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it's easy as that.
Thanks, Sandra. Yeah, and actually, I mean, in the moment, in the classroom setting, like, well, so most of the times I'm also instructing for parents to model this for their kids. And one of the best learning experiences is when the parent is at a very high stress level and they're really needing to calm down. And so they do this exercise with their child, right? So something very similar can happen for the educator in a classroom. If you're starting to feel pretty overwhelmed, or you're just like, I really need a break, and you're willing to do it with your entire class, I mean, that's one of the best ways, you know, to model this. And then if you're willing to also share, look, I am here on this mood chart right now, and so we're gonna engage in this. And so doing this and then pointing again, you know, I'm kind of at the same place, which could be okay on the mood chart, and just acknowledging that, because what you're teaching that skill of, I'm going to check in with myself, do something, and then check in again. See how effective that was. And then this is something that I like to call your build your own care manual or information manual about yourself. So, you know, I had a friend who recently gave me this really cool gift, which was a plant. It's actually right here. Oh, you can't, my blurred background. It's a plant. So it was a plant that was sent in the mail, and it came with an instruction manual. And so it's right here on like the light that it needs, the water, the food, additional care. And then it even has, which is very important for me, it has like, when the leaves are turning this color, you did this, right? So like all the things about what happens when there are stressors in the environment. And so the idea is that, you know, how amazing would it be if we all came with our own care manuals, right? When stressed, do this, you know, when needing relaxation, put in sun. And so the idea is that you can build your own and help your students build your own, and that this is something that can be revised and adjusted over time. And so here are some of the questions that you might, or prompts that you could consider in making this care manual for yourself. So under what conditions are you your best self? How do you know? What are the warning signs that you're starting to get a little bit out of balance? Are there specific triggers or warning signals that you should watch out for, or stressors? And then how do you get back in balance? Right? There could be a section, you know, for students, it could be, how do you want your teacher to support you during this time? How do you want other people in your life supporting you when something like this is going on? And again, really revising and revisiting this as needed. You know, the other practice that's actually, well, it's not totally practice, it's more of an exercise that's coming to mind that I forgot to do when we were talking about that context piece. We can just go ahead and do it right now. So taking a minute, I'll just, let me just time us. Take a minute, go ahead and look in your space again, or wherever you are, and see if you can identify all of the things that are blue, the color blue. Okay, and you may also be, try and see if you can keep like a count in your head. I just realized that I had a lot of blue things, so that I lost track, but maybe like a general number, you know, tens or that. Okay, so that was a full minute. Now, the question that I have for you is, how many of the things in your environment were orange? Oh, you can't look at your space again. Sorry. I just noticed some people were looking at their space again. So I may have done that exercise a little, but I wasn't clear with the instructions. But the idea is that actually this is a great exercise to teach students about implicit bias. And so the whole point is when you are looking for something specific, how much in your environment are you missing? Right, so the application then to say what you might want to include in your care manual are the biases that we have or that we hold, the assumptions that we're making about our students, and in particular our students of color. What context are we, what are we missing? You know, there's a lot that we miss when we're going into a situation and just seeing what we usually see. Okay, now we're going to talk about building habits. So we have kind of run through a litany of different types of regulation strategies, and one of the and that's great. You know, it's great to know what's accessible to you, and also, again, if that number one thing of practice is not practiced, then you know, then it feels like yeah, there's not follow through, or it can't actually become a habit. And so actually thinking through how exactly do you build a habit when you're trying to start something new? And one of the examples that I take is from behavioral medicine. And with this, the idea is that you start as small as you can. And so in thinking about flossing, this actually can be really useful if anybody is struggling with their flossing at night, potentially in the morning. And you are asked to floss just one tooth. Just floss one per day. That's it. And what they end up finding out is that once you're already there, you're going to do all the rest, right? Most of the times, or maybe you'll at least do half, right? So that's more than one. And so the same is true for these types of regulation practices, right? What is it like if you just told yourself, I'm just going to notice one breath on Monday. So you're doing it, you know, one breath once a week. Yeah, that's small, manageable. You feel like you can do it. Right, so start small. And then the other piece is who's one person or multiple people who you could potentially tell to help make that accountable. And so this is something that when we go into our breakout groups, you can consider this, as my partner calls it, accountability pods. You know, you can try and identify an accountability buddy to one of these very small practices that you want to try for yourself. And then of course, the most important thing to building a habit is what's your plan B, C, D through Z? What do you anticipate is going to get in the way? And what are some of the things that you can do about that? And so another example that people have used is something, some of you may have used this before, are SMART goals, right? And so SMART goals also have their own, there are also holes within SMART goals, right? Of like any so when you're in your small groups, you can feel free to use this template. You know, we'll paste in the specific the acronym to help you along the way. But you know, the specificity is like how small are you getting? You know, I just want to notice one breath one day out of the week. How are you gonna keep track of this? Like, what would that look like? Maybe it's just like you tally it, or you're noting it for yourself, or telling somebody else. And then how are you gonna make this happen? This other component is, why does this matter to you? Why does doing that one breath out of the week? You know, is it because you feel like you'll be able to show up for other people in your life better? And that you're going to help sustain yourself through the remainder of the school year. And then timeline, you know, for yourself, like, do you just want to try this out for, I don't know, 3 weeks? Or maybe you just want to try it out for 1 week and just evaluate how it's going. That's totally up to you. So you can use this template, and or if you've already used SMART goals before, you can talk about, you know, what are the things that got in the way of executing a plan like this. And so this is where, at this point, for those who are watching on the recording, you know, thank you so much for your attention and for coming and practicing with us. And this is the end of the recording, so that at this time, we still encourage you to go through this SMART goal practice on your own. And then we're going to, for those who are attending right now live, we're going to go ahead and go into our